The forest stretched endlessly before Henry, its snow-laden trees casting long shadows in the pale winter light. The crunch of his boots on the frozen ground was the only sound as he made his way deeper into the woods, the quiet solitude gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He stopped abruptly, his breath catching as the light glinted off something unnatural ahead. A massive block of ice stood along the riverbank, its smooth surface gleaming faintly in the weak sunlight. Inside, a shadowy figure loomed, distorted and unrecognizable beneath layers of frost. But before we start our story, smash the like button, make sure to subscribe, and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. Henry Calloway had always embraced the quiet isolation of his forest lodge. A retired teacher and a widower, he found solace in the simplicity of his daily routine. The lodge, built by his grandfather, sat at the edge of a vast expanse of wilderness, where the towering pines seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. His days revolved around tending to the land and the small flock of animals he kept for company. This particular morning, the cold seemed sharper, cutting through the air like a knife. After breakfast, Henry slipped into his thickest coat, gloves, and boots, bracing himself against the biting cold. He stepped out onto the frozen ground, his breath forming misty clouds in the crisp air. He fed the chickens, scattering grain across the snow-dusted yard, and made sure the sheep's water trough wasn't iced over. The animals seemed uneasy, shifting restlessly as if they sensed the storm coming. Once the animals were settled, Henry turned his attention to the woodpile. When he reached the woodpile, he frowned. What had once been a towering stack of neatly split logs was now reduced to a few stragglers, barely enough to keep the fire going through the day. Henry rubbed his hands together, his breath forming puffs of mist. He couldn't remember burning through the wood so quickly, but there was no use complaining about it now. The storm wouldn't wait, and neither could he. "Guess it's time to get to work," he said to no one in particular. He headed to the shed, grabbed his axe, and prepared to make the trek into the woods. Little did he know, his morning would take a turn that he never would have seen coming. As he made his way to his favorite chopping spot, Henry thought of the stories his grandmother used to tell. As Henry swung his axe into a fallen log, something unusual caught his eye. Through the dense cluster of trees ahead, a strange, shimmering light flickered. It was faint, but it stood out against the muted whites and grays of the winter landscape. Frowning, he straightened and wiped his brow. "What's that now?" he muttered. Curiosity got the better of him, and he set down his axe to trudge toward the light. Henry followed the glimmer through the trees into a small clearing. There, half buried in snow and ice, was something he couldn't quite understand. In the center stood a thick block of ice, clear as glass. It looked deliberately placed, like a monument. Inside was a shadowy figure, its shape unclear through the frost. Limbs, maybe a head, were visible, but the details were obscured. The unclear form made it more unsettling. Whatever was frozen inside looked large and menacing. His heart pounded as he stepped closer, breath fogging the air. The ice radiated a strange stillness, almost as if time itself had stopped around it. Henry hesitated before pressing a gloved hand against the surface. It was unnaturally cold, as though it didn't belong to this world. A shiver ran down his spine, not from the cold, but from the eerie energy coming from the ice. The figure inside looked nearly alive, suspended in time. The frost distorted its shape, giving the illusion of movement, a twitch, a shift. But that was impossible. His thoughts raced as he tried to make sense of it. "What even is this?" he whispered. "What are you?" Despite being a seasoned man of 60 years, Henry was rattled. Logic told him to walk away, but his curiosity rooted him to the spot. Whatever this was, it didn't belong here, forgotten in the snow. He decided to bring it back with him. Fetching his sled, he pulled it to the clearing and laid down a tarp. The block was heavier than expected, forcing him to dig in his heels for leverage. After multiple tries, he finally tipped the ice onto the sled with a dull, vibrating thud. Panting, Henry took a deep breath, his heart racing from effort or fear. "Guess I'm taking you home," he muttered. gripping the sled's rope and dragging it through the snow. The added weight made every step harder, carving deep grooves into the white landscape. The forest around him felt different now, heavier, charged. Every crack of a branch or shift of snow made his pulse quicken. Still, he pressed on, stealing glances at the block behind him, half expecting the figure to stir. By the time the lodge came into view, Henry's legs ached and sweat clung to his back despite the cold. He paused to catch his breath and studied the ice. The figure seemed to shift slightly in the dimming light. He shook his head, uneasy but determined. At the lodge, he guided the sled to the back porch and unloaded the block with the help of a crowbar, easing it into place against a wooden plank. It wasn't perfect, but it would keep the ice stable while he decided what to do next. Standing back, he examined the figure again. The frosted surface made it impossible to identify. The shadows inside danced with suggestion. Was it a wolf or something stranger? Henry rubbed his gloved hands together, staring at the block. The storm was fast approaching, and he needed to focus on preparing for the night. But he knew he wouldn't be able to shake the image of that shadowy figure from his mind. "Guess we're in this together now," he muttered, stepping back inside the lodge. His muscles ached from dragging the sled, the mysterious ice block weighing heavily both physically and mentally. Though the figure inside hadn't moved, each glance sparked new unease. At the lodge, he maneuvered the sled to the shaded porch, tipped the block onto the snow, and covered it with a tarp. The cold would keep it intact while he figured out what to do next. "Whatever you are," he muttered, "you're not staying out here alone for long." Inside, the warmth of the wood stove was a welcome relief. He reached for the phone and called the only person he trusted with something like this, his cousin, Sophie Clark. An ecologist with Arctic field experience, Sophie might help him understand what he'd found. She answered after 2 rings. "Henry? Calling in the middle of the day? What's the occasion?" "I found something in the woods. A block of ice. With something inside. A creature." Sophie's tone shifted. "What kind of creature?" "I don't know. It's big. Doesn't look like anything I've seen before." After a pause, she said, "You're serious?" "I'm dead serious. You've got to come see it." "All right. I'll be there in an hour. Don't do anything stupid till I get there. No promises," he replied, half joking. He hung up and called Russ, the local mechanic. "Probably just a bear," Russ scoffed. "Got itself frozen in a thaw." Henry chuckled but felt the weight of what he'd discovered. He decided to keep things quiet. For now, Sophie was enough. An hour later, headlights appeared in the snowy drive. Sophie stepped out, bundled in a parka and carrying a backpack. "All right, Henry," she called. "What's this all about?" "Come see for yourself," he said, leading her to the block. She knelt beside it and pulled back the tarp, her breath caught. "Whoa! This is remarkable." Even through the frosted ice, the figure appeared unusual. Its size and faint antler-like shape seemed out of place. She ran a gloved hand over the smooth surface. "This looks like glacial ice. The clarity... it's ancient." Henry crouched beside her. "It was just sitting out there. What do you think it is?" Sophie pulled out a small scanner and ran it over the block. "Could be a flash-frozen animal, maybe even prehistoric. But the body structure, it's not like anything I've studied." Henry shivered, uncertain whether it was the cold or something else. "Is it dangerous?" Sophie's expression grew serious. "It's hard to imagine something still alive in there, but the ice is preserving it. If it thaws, we might learn more, but I'll need help." Back inside the lodge, Henry brewed coffee while Sophie reviewed her scans at the kitchen table. The wind howled outside, the fire casting flickering shadows across the room. "This is above my expertise," Sophie admitted. "I know some glaciologists and paleobiologists who'd love to see this. I'll send them the scans and photos. It could be a major discovery." Henry handed her a mug. "Do you think this will bring a lot of attention to Pine Hollow?" "It might," she replied, "but let's take it one step at a time. It's safe out there for now." By morning, Sophie had emailed 2 colleagues, Dr. Clara Reynolds, a glaciologist in Ottawa, and Dr. Victor Yates, a paleobiologist from Vancouver. Both responded quickly. Clara confirmed the ice was ancient, likely thousands of years old, but Victor's reply stood out. This could be groundbreaking. From the outline, it doesn't resemble any modern species I know. Possibly prehistoric or unknown. Henry let out a whistle. That's something, Sophie nodded. This might be bigger than we thought. That night, as temperatures dropped, Henry checked the ice regularly. He had reinforced the tarp and positioned it away from the house to avoid heat exposure, but he remained anxious. Each visit outside, flashlight in hand, the figure remained still. He whispered, "Hang in there," as though it could hear him. By mid-morning, Sophie returned with Clara and Victor. Clara, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, extended her hand. "You've got quite the find here, Mr. Calloway." Victor, animated and eager, asked, "Still cold?" "No cracks." "All intact," Henry said, leading them to the ice block. Clara and Victor examined it closely. "This is extraordinary," Clara said. "The clarity suggests glacial preservation for millennia." Victor squinted at the shadowy figure. "Those proportions. This isn't a modern animal." Using portable equipment, they scanned the ice, measured density, and took detailed images. Sophie translated the findings for Henry as they worked. "The risk," Clara explained, "is if the ice melts unevenly, it could destroy the specimen." "So what's next?" Henry asked. "We need to understand what's inside before transporting it," Sophie said. "Once we're ready, it'll go to a lab with proper facilities." The team worked late into the night. By morning, they reviewed the data. Victor tapped the monitor with a grin. "Based on the proportions, I'm almost certain it's a prehistoric ground sloth." "Likely from the Pleistocene," Henry blinked. "A sloth? That's what's been sitting out there?" Victor chuckled. "Not your average tree sloth. These were massive and roamed this region thousands of years ago." Sophie added, "This is an incredible find. The preservation is remarkable. It could be the best specimen ever discovered." Henry laughed, relief washing over him. "I spent all week thinking it was a monster. A sloth? That's almost charming." With the ice stabilized, the team coordinated with a university lab to safely move it. News spread fast. Pine Hollow was suddenly filled with reporters and scientists buzzing about the discovery. For Henry, it was surreal. His quiet life at the lodge had become the center of global attention. Though glad the sloth would be properly studied, he felt pride knowing he had played a part. Months later, the ground sloth became the star of a museum exhibit, drawing visitors nationwide. Pine Hollow, once known only for its woods and winter, was now famous for an astonishing discovery, and Henry Calloway would forever be part of its story.